You're listening to the Call Kent podcast, where Kent C. Dodds answers questions and gives insights to software engineers like you. Now, let's hear the call.
Hi, folks. My name is Bruno, and Kent, I have a question for you. When planning end-to-end tests, what do you do when you have to test some actions that need previous actions? Let's say, for example, that I have a resource and I want to test deletion. But to test deletion, I have to create a resource first. So in my head, I would have some sort of pipeline to test when talking about end-to-end tests. Is like I would test creation and after I would test deletion, like step by step. But I don't know if it is a good pattern or if tools like Playwright or Cypress would allow that. I see some folks doing like create separated tests, one for creation and another for deletion. And on deletion, they kind of duplicate what they did for the creation step. But does that sound right? Because I have to duplicate a lot of things and wait for things that are already tested and done. So I would like to know your thoughts about what do you do when you have to deal with those scenarios where you want to test something that needs from previous actions or previous data and this kind of stuff. Thank you.
And that was the call. Here's what Kent had to say.
Hey, Bruno, thank you so much for the question. This is a pretty common one. The first thing that I'll say is you definitely want to avoid over-testing. And I think I have one blog post that talks about this that I will find and put a link in the notes for this episode. But yeah, over-testing, which is effectively just doing the same thing in multiple tests, where you're testing the same thing. The problem is that if you break that particular feature, then all of the tests will break, and it can be difficult to find out, okay, what specifically was the problem? And so while over-testing is not necessarily a bad thing, like you got to render the component. And so every test is going to render the component. So like you're not ever going to avoid over-testing 100%. But yeah, I would not create the resource in every single test or like go through the login flow before proceeding in a test that needs a logged in user. And so the solution there is to create a utility that for login in particular, you create a utility that will simulate the logged in state. And what I typically do is I have utilities in Playwright or in Cypress that allow me to interact directly with the database. And so sure, I'll have one test that tests the creation of a new product, but then I'll have another test that uses the utility that just creates the new product in the database and then proceeds as if the product already exists, because of course it does. So that is the approach that I take, and I'm actually working on, or I have this in Rocket Rental right now for Epic Web, and I'm going to be teaching how to do this in my upcoming testing workshop. So you could take a look at coming to that potentially. But yeah, that's the solution for me is to, and I should say another thing that I will often do is my end-to-end tests typically cover several steps of use cases. So my end-to-end tests are typically quite long, relatively long. And so rather than testing a very specific minimal thing, I'm testing like an entire user workflow. So the user, typically I'll do login and onboarding and reset password as separate things. And then I'll have a utility for just getting a logged in user. But then from there, I'll say, okay, so given that I have a logged in user, now let's go to the product page. Let's verify the amount is what I would expect and add to cart and make sure that my cart gets updated. Now let's go to the checkout flow and we'll go through that process. So like typically, my end-to-end tests are going to cover a lot. And so if you wanted to test resource creation and update and delete, like I would probably do all of that in one test, like create the resource, make an edit to it, and then delete it. And, you know, if those were the features that your application had. So create the product, make a change to the description, and then delete the product, and then make sure that the product isn't in the product listing page anymore, something like that. So yeah, there are a couple options there, but the core takeaway here is avoid over testing, because it's just wasteful. It makes your test take longer. It makes it harder to identify what actually broke when something breaks. Yeah, I hope that is helpful to you, and I hope you have a nice day.
This has been the Call Kent podcast. Learn more about Kent at kentcdodds.com and get your own questions answered at kentcdodds.com/calls.